In 1990, I had a dematerialization event while meditating with the sacred fire sitting inside my copper pyramid in Colorado. I was upstairs on my bedroom floor meditating with the sacred fire, which I had been actively using since about 1986. And while I was meditating with the fire, I began to feel this tingling inside of my bones and muscles. And I just kind of monitored it but kept meditating, and eventually this tingling that was inside my bones and muscles then began to kind of come to the surface of the top of my skin, and I began to feel tingly all over my skin. And I was rubbing my skin, my arms, and I just decided to relax, because using the sacred fire, you get all kinds of experiences. And so I have learned to trust what was happening. And as I was meditating, this pressure from inside of my bones and muscles right down into the core of the cells of my body just began to build and build, and it felt like a strong pressure. And I could see with my inner eye sort of the cells of my body begin to become come loose and unravel. And at the moment I had that awareness, there was this massive feeling of acceleration, and then poof, I was all particles of golden light floating around in space. I didn't have a body, but I did have a sense of sight, and my consciousness was fully alert and aware, and I knew where I was, that I was in my house in Colorado. And when I would look around the house, I began to see what used to be walls as these little golden particles of light all following each other in a line. And so I would see the outline of walls. I would see the outline of furniture, but it wasn't solid. And I began to move outside, and I could see these little golden particles sort of in lines flowing in the same direction, creating an outline of trees and shrubs. And when I would take my focus off of a tree or off of something that I knew was the outside wall of my house, it would disappear, and there would be nothing but golden particles of light. So I began to have this real sense of knowing that my focus was creating reality. I could focus on something and the outline would come into a form. And then I could take my focus off of it and it would all be particles of light. Yet when I looked at my body, there was no form. I had no form whatsoever. I was just golden particles of light. I don't know how long this lasted, but at a certain point, I began to feel a de-acceleration, and things began to feel like it was slowing down, because I was sitting at a high vibration when all of this had occurred, and everything began to feel like slowing down. And when it slowed down, within an instant, I was back in my physical form, standing downstairs in my living room. And I had this profound experience, one of the most profound experiences of my life, other than meeting my ascended self, which is in another video. And I had known, I had been visited shortly within a matter of an hour from this by an immortal that I was working with. And between that time and that time, I had this knowing that thought particles were what held together reality, and that these thought particles, when I would take my thought off of something, the reality would disappear. And when I would put my thought on something, the reality would appear. And about an hour later, when I was communicating with an immortal that I was working with, he explained it to me in more detail that when the body dematerializes, these thought particles create a reality for our life in blueprints. So everything that has consciousness has its own blueprint, and thought holds that blueprint together. And when those blueprints, when the thought that's holding those blueprints begins to expand, in other words, consciousness is expanding and growing up in frequency or in higher frequencies of light, that thought particle begins to fall apart. And when it falls apart, that concept, that idea, that materialization is no longer there. Now you're just thought. But thought has substance, and that's why I was seeing the golden particles, because there was substance, because thought was thinking of itself in substance. And so this is an acceleration, an expansion of consciousness. And when I came back and rematerialized from being upstairs in my bedroom to downstairs in my living room, that blueprint that was still in existence in my divine blueprint, I began to slow down my thought, and so thought began to rematerialize in a slower vibration or third density vibration, and that original blueprint of the body and the house began to become solidified again. And so I was told I was allowed this experience because I had been working a long time with the fire by then. I had been willing to allow it to do what it needed to do or wanted to do in order to expand my consciousness. I was receptive and I was non-resistant. And so the experience was given to me so that I could understand more about consciousness. And this was a profound experience that began my more deeper understanding of the densities of consciousness and how we are living in a pre-programmed consciousness, in a pre-programmed program of consciousness, or conscious pre-programming. Not sure the way to put that, but it's pre-programmed consciousness. There's the right term. We are living in pre-programmed consciousness. In other words, a higher consciousness has programmed our reality. And so for purposes of this experience, consciousness has pre-programmed a reality, and bodies are presented and created by our divine blueprint. See my many videos on divine blueprint and consciousness. Bodies are created that match this pre-programmed consciousness view of reality. So we incarnate, and that's what an avatar is. Avatars, which is what I call what we are, because the soul is the container for consciousness, and our blueprint creates these bodies. And bodies I call avatars because it is consciousness coming into material form. That's an avatar. And so consciousness has chosen, or our soul, which is a container for consciousness with all these blueprints it has chosen to experience this reality, which is pre-programmed to some extent by a higher consciousness. And so by choosing to come into this reality, we choose the kind of body that is limited and structured to this reality. And it is a very limited, very small bandwidth of reality that we live in here. But it was never meant to be a prison. It was meant to be an experience. And eons and eons ago, we were much more malleable with our consciousness. Consciousness could travel up and down our divine blueprint. In other words, we could manifest a body down here, play in this particular pre-programmed consciousness, and then release the body and go into a different pre-programmed consciousness. But we became trapped here because we became addicted to this sensory reality. And I have mentioned this in many videos, but also in my book, which talked about this dematerialization experience. We became so addicted to the sensory, this very limited bandwidth of sensory experience, that we hardened our consciousness to being in love and addicted to the body and its sensory experiences. So we pretty much encaged ourselves. And pretty much because we are so addicted to the body, when we die, and I've mentioned this in many videos, we go over into an astral body that is exactly like this world. And that world, that astral world that people have talked about for thousands of years, is an emotional thought print created from our bodies here. Our bodies here, being so addicted, have created this counter mirror image of this reality in the astral worlds because we don't want to let it go. So when we die, we go over into another reality just slightly different than this one, with a body that's very similar to this, in fact identical to this, but just in an astral, illusiony, emotional thought pattern world. And we meet our dead relatives, our aunts and uncles, our cousins, our mother, father, grandparents, and we go off and we live in a reality with that same lineage that we came in on. And I've said this in other videos. So we never really move up our divine blueprint like we're supposed to. So this whole library of teachings is designed to help us get out of the addiction of this physical reality and start to accept that there are higher frequencies of reality, alternate frequencies of reality. You might even say that some are higher, some are lower, some are about the same, but they are alternate realities. And until you can let go of your addiction to your family lineage, to your family idea, to the addiction of physical senses, because some of these other realities don't have the high addiction of the sex or high addiction of foods, the sensory pleasures of foods and alcohols, and most importantly, some of these alternate realities do, but they're more astral, and some of them are fourth density. They still have emotions which are fear-driven or pleasure-driven, but pretty much our reality has the most intense fear and pleasure-driven sensory experience you can possibly go through. And this was because originally when this reality was created, it was not anywhere this kind of addiction. The sensory pleasure and the sensory fear was moderate to mild, like other realities. But there was other forces that had seen this new frontier that was being created here and worked and sort of manipulated the bodies by reprogramming the blueprint to some degree through our DNA, since you have to be a pattern keeper to actually work with the divine blueprint. If you aren't, you fiddle with DNA, and they tweaked everything to make it a more intense experience because they got seduced to the intensity of the experience. So our reality has this high intensity experience, and that's what causes it to be so addictive and keeps us trapped here by our own focus of ourself. We are self-focused and we are self-identified with pain and pleasure. And so I wanted to tell you about this experience because this was really a profound step in my evolution to beginning to understand how to totally release my attachment to this reality. And I have started now a Patreon group, and it officially kicks off July 1st. I'd like for you to all come and join me July 1st. I am putting a link below so that you can go and look at it now if you want to. I suggest July 1st because then you can get the beginning. When you subscribe, you'll get the whole month. But it's there now. And I'm mentioning this so that you can come and join. And inside of our Patreon group, we're going to get down and study all of our spiritual skills, all of our abilities, lucid dreaming, astral travel, premonitions, transferring consciousness into other bodies. We're going to get into our daily life, the problems that we're working with. We're going to be surrounded by a thought of abundance. We're not victims in this group. It's not that you can't, we're going to talk about our problems and our challenges, but we're going to look at it from higher perspective, how we can see it from a higher point of view, and therefore work through them as challenges to growth and not as victim consciousness. We're going to live in abundance. And so I'd like to offer this to you at this time. So please be sure and see that link below. And I will talk to you in the next video. Thank you.